All right, we are live. Hey, everybody, it's nice to be back and see you. It is the Conservation Conversation, and today, so many people requested that they wanted to speak to Tish a little bit more, that we are going to have her back on the show today. So it's very exciting. Today, we're going to talk about a very interesting aspect of how science is used for the benefit of the polluters, the benefit of the bad guys, basically. Now, we're not here to discuss if science is valid or not, but I think what we are here to discuss is how is science used as a tool for control through regulatory agencies. Now, last time Tish was on, she really expanded my mind and really was incredible to talk to her about regulatory agencies, how they work, and where the sort of the flaw is within them. So anyway, we're going to get right into it today. So we're going to go ahead and start off. And here we go. Remember, it's our world. Let's talk about it. Okay, here we go. So the opening was supposed to. And we had a bad opening there, but today is the business of science with our special guest, Tish. So we're going to now hop right into the show. Before we bring Tish on, I always like to start the show with one quote. And today I thought the quote, we would honor it with one of my favorite people in the world, Emma Goldman. If you're not familiar with Emma Goldman, I recommend to Google her and check her out. And Emma says, "I'd rather have roses on my table than diamonds on my neck." Now, there's a few reasons that that's very relevant to today, because what we're talking about is the perception of what nature is to us. And we have grown up in sort of a constructed reality where nature is starting to become thought of as natural resources for our use, instead of looking at the land, respecting the land, and finding the beauty. I was looking at the quote earlier and somebody said to me, you know, what's beautiful about that is that if you wear diamonds on your neck, you're not wearing them for you, you're wearing them for other people to see and adorn you. And instead, if you have roses, everybody gets to participate and enjoy the beauty of that. So that's exactly in line with what we're going to talk about today. So without much more conversation, let's go ahead and bring Tish in. Hey, Tish, how are you?
Great, Eric. I love that conversation. Thanks for having me back.
I'm so glad to have you back on the show. After we had you on the first time, so many people wanted to have a longer show. They had so many more questions to talk to you about. So I really appreciate you taking the time, coming in and joining us today.
Yeah, I keep wondering what kind of trouble you're going to get me in today.
Let's see what we can do. We always get in trouble no matter what. It's a good sign, right?
Yeah, it'll be fine.
Well, what I wanted to do is start off with the concept of the business of science. Now, you know, that's the title that I picked for this show because before I started speaking to you, I didn't really understand the way that it's used and misused. And like I was telling the audience, it's not so much about questioning science, but questioning the application of how science is used within regulatory agencies. So to start us off, if you wouldn't mind, for people that are just tuning in the first time, give us a very brief idea of how these regulatory agencies are sort of in place. We always think they're in place to protect us, but they're actually in place to protect the companies that are poisoning us. And then I'd love to talk about how they use science against us.
Right. Yeah, for people who aren't aware, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, we kind of have come up with this model. We just use it as a visual, a graphic to help people understand kind of where we are. And we call it the box of allowable activism. And one side of the box is the regulatory fallacy. That's what we call it. And, you know, we believe that that's our immunities from harms that are proposed, whether it's fracking, you know, whether it's industrial agriculture, whether it's big farm, it doesn't matter. It's landfills, pesticide spraying. we think that's how we're going to stop the harm, is through this regulatory model and going to the agencies that have been set up to protect us and the environment. And what we find when we get there, and we're living with over 40 years of this type of environmental law in place, almost 50 years. And where's the environment? It's a trash, right? Our communities are all being destroyed. And what they do is set up, agencies, and we go to those agencies as concerned residents and activists and, make our case why this proposed project is going to be harmful. And what we find ourselves doing is, who determines, how long we can speak, what we can talk about. What are we, you'll bring up things if you've gone to a regulatory hearing. I've been to several of them, and you'll say, well, I'm concerned about the air that, or the particulates that are going to be put in the air from this factory that's got a pipeline that's going to go in. And they'll go, oh, no, you can't talk about that. That's not what we're here to talk about. We're doing the water permit today, and we're here to talk about, a specific chemical and how many parts per million the company is allowed to put in the water. And so we find ourselves then talking about something we didn't even want to, we weren't there to talk about. But we feel like, as citizens, residents, community members, that we've done our part, that we did the best we could. We said why we didn't want it, but it's all about regulating the harm, not prohibiting the harm. And who determines what those amounts are is usually the industry itself. The community get to decide. So it's all a very controlled, it kind of put a blanket on us when we think there's a protection agency, because we think that they're the ones protecting us. And what we all have found out is that that's not really true.
That is exactly, when I was in Florida, I saw a lot of that, where they would have group, community meetings. And the people would get up, and like Mitch was saying, there's a 3-minute limit on what the citizens are allowed to say, but the experts for the companies are allowed to go on as long as they want. And Mitch also brings up a great point that permits give permissions.
Right.
They're basically there to ensure that the companies are allowed to do their work as they see fit.
Right.
Now, one thing that I did notice too with them is, for example, a lot of people will come in and say, we've done radiation readings, and they're very, very high. And then they'll bring in the experts to explain why their science is not usable. And I find that a lot of people get very frustrated because they go out, they get water testing done, they get, radon testing. And, in the state of Florida, not to always pick on Florida, but they're one of the most they just let it all out. Like, they don't care. They just disregard the people without any kind of worry about that. The one thing is, in the radon levels in Florida can be between 300 to 10,000. That's the acceptable, size. So as you're saying, that's kind of an example for everybody to understand that these are the limits that the companies are placing, that these regulatory agents are placing, and they have no weight to them. So now, what I'm concerned about to talk about today is, so you have people that are trying to fight back through science. How does science work when it comes to regulatory agencies?
Right. Well, you have to, and it's so funny because you have to, and what you said, a lot of it is that, they're permitted. So what happens at the regulatory hearing, and there's acceptable limits, like what you brought up, which is so funny that that's what they're called, right? So they're acceptable limits of poisons and toxins and harmful things to us and the environment. Well, who decides what those acceptable limits are? It's usually the industry, right? They're coming up with what is acceptable. Then they also self-monitor, and that permit that the agency gives to them then makes the harm they're doing to you legal. So when you try to go to court to say this is harmful, you can't, because the judge looks at it and goes, well, they have a permit, which makes what they're doing legal. So you wind up in this, that's part of this box, and we talk about it We focus on a single industry, a single bill in the legislature, a single chemical. And while we're busy, on all these individual issues, we're not attacking the system itself. And Sherry Straub, who is there in Florida, working with Clean Water Now, trying to promote change and rights of nature in Florida, she had a really good example this morning. She talked about, just think of a box, and so put all this stuff in, whether it's a permit for, like I said, the landfill, or if you're working on a bill in the legislature to stop something, or a chemical. But I said, no one's got the box cutters trying to take the box down, putting all this stuff in the box. So it was a good visual, I thought.
I like that. And it's a very complicated concept. So to have something like that where you can think of it in a very in a very simple visual way, I think is very important for people, because they've overcomplicated it to keep us from being able to approach it.
Right. And so we have billions, we have billions of dollars that they distribute to fund more research and more testing, and all that. So we see this in Ohio, like with Lake Erie Bill of Rights. I mean, over the years, there was one group that kind of went back to look, and I mean, it's over $1 billion to study the algae problem over and over again. And I'm sure Florida have this if you went back and looked at how much, there's a ton of money spent on research, and yet we know the cause of the algae. We know we have growing dead zones in Lake Erie. We know what it's from. But and it's more polluted than ever. They're getting worse. And capitalism has used science. This whole regulatory model, it created a whole generation of environmental scientists who work for regulatory agencies, and they believe that they're there to prove that the environment isn't being destroyed, that they're actually protected. But they've been duped, and so have the environmental activists. And I'm including myself in that statement, but because before I got involved in this work and started, decolonizing my own mind and thinking of differently, I believe the same thing. Activists use science to prove harm so that they can take action, and more studies to justify opposing something rather than preventing something that we already know is bad.
That's very well said, because that is the thing. I mean, even myself, in some of the work I've been doing recently, I've been doing water testing, air quality testing, and they are always a way that they can use their studies to prove that it's not harmful, but they reject our work to prove that everything is fine, and we're trying to say it's harmful. And it's difficult because even as we've seen with COVID, people, if they can't see it, and they can't taste it, and they can't touch it, it becomes abstract, and it becomes very complicated, and it allows these companies to really, it seems to me, to kind of work in the gray zone. My friend Dr. Schwartz, Jesse Schwartz, is on, and he says the limits are an agreed upon number of deaths so as not to inhibit commerce. Welcome to capitalism. And Jesse actually does work with a lot of indigenous tribes up in Washington, and has run into the same issue over and over. So now, and by the way, I do want to mention, I got to watch the documentary Invisible Hand, and it was outstanding. It really challenges the concept. And as we go through and we talk about how these regulatory agencies are using science to continue their business and paying for their own results and their own self-regulation and their own lab work, one thing that is very important is the way that we conceive of nature and natural resources. Kind of going back to the Emma Goldman quote a little bit. It's a very we sort of see it as something that should be used by us, and that is actually only a very modern idea. And one thing that I learned in Invisible Hand was the depth and the length of time that people have viewed the world in very different eyes. And I was wondering if you could talk about that real fast for us, sort of the modern construct, society construct of how we're viewing our natural resources versus the other constructs, more indigenous or First Nation people, how they perceive the limits, and how maybe we need a change in our framework of thinking to really go back and attack these problems.
Oh yeah, I love this question.
Good.
Yeah. And I'm a white woman. I'm no expert on indigenous culture and their beliefs, but I've been reading a lot, trying to obviously learn. One of the books I'm reading now is Braiding Sweetgrass, which is so interesting to me. I have it here. It's Rob Wall Kimmer. You can see it. And it's interesting to me because she is a scientist. She's indigenous, but she went to school. She has her PhD in botany, I believe. And so she's, in both worlds. And so it's fascinating. But science really can be manipulated, as we know. And, we co-opt burden of proof, and science progressives are the ones actually who put a lot of emphasis on science and the experts. And we look at it as kind of like an attack on common sense and indigenous ecological knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. We colonized to believe that we need a study before we can stop a harm. And I remember I used to tell the story when I first started in this work, organizing, about my grandfather. And I didn't tie it to until I was reading this book. But, he was an immigrant from Italy. They farmed over in Italy for generations, only had an 8th grade education, came to this country, did construction work. And I remember my dad and his brother telling the stories over and over again, like there was some project he was doing and there was chemicals, I guess, used in whatever they were doing. And one of them went to put the bucket of whatever it was down the drain, and my grandfather stopped him and yelled at them and said, "Don't do that. Don't put that down the drain, because whatever you put down that drain is going to come back to us. We garden, we grow our own food. This is an 8th grade education, right?" Mm-hmm. And so that's that indigenous knowledge. I know my relatives in Germany, they know a lot about plants and how to use plants, identifying various plants. And we have come to doubt ourselves. And so, like in my own personal example, in my community, I was sued by a driller. And I had made the comment because I knew I had been studying fracking and I knew the process, and my common sense, I don't have a degree in this, but I could tell that probably what's coming back up based on what I learned was radioactive. Well, at the time, there were no studies. There was no science to back me up on that. So, it was difficult. I couldn't prove things. I also didn't have a lot of money to go get tests on the product. But fast forward to today, this same product is being used that I was sued for saying it was radioactive. And there's several studies now showing that it has high radium levels, scientific studies, right? But guess what? It doesn't matter. They're still spreading it on the roads.
Right.
You ask yourself, does science really make a difference? I know it should, but does it? So, and again, when you think about the whole big system and how it's set up to benefit the wealthy, the most money, the 1% versus the 99%, who can afford to do scientific studies to prove what they want? The wealthy, right? Just like in our system, they say, "Oh, sue us if you don't like what we're doing." Well, who can afford the lawyers in this? It's the 1%. So the whole system, again, is created for that 1% elite to make more money and profit. And, it all works together. So it's all part of this. And science, you have to think, look at history. There's so many examples. They used science to justify slavery. And I looked up, there was this article in the Washington Post in 2019, and the title of it is "A Brief History of the Enduring Phony Science That Perpetuates White Supremacy." So, wow. Right. So, there was a movement to abolish slavery. And once that movement started growing, this is an actual quote because Jefferson had written something, but this doctor at the time, he said, "Before, science wasn't essential to justify slavery, but now, under threat, the then 250-year-old institution was direly in need of a scientific rationale. And yet it was human connection and morality that stopped slavery, not science." The abolitionists didn't use science as a reason, right, to stop slavery. It's like, this is wrong. This is morally wrong. Of course, we had a war, but, and we saw it again in Nazi Germany. U.S. Holocaust Museum website, And you'll find all kinds of information about this. But we knew they did all kinds of experiments to justify annihilating Jewish people or, disabled people, whatever. But they had scientific backing. So, science really is manipulated and can be manipulated.
Those are really powerful and amazing examples of how it has been used for the good of that 1%. And it actually, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because as I was in Florida, I wanted to get more water testing done. And I went to a group, very well-known environmental protection group. And I said, I want to get these tests done. They said, well, it's going to cost us $100,000. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. So these communities don't have the resources to fight back. Even if they spent that money, we know that by the time it gets up into the system, it's going to be, they're going to ignore it anyway. They're going to say it's this problem or that problem. So it feels like it's sort of an enclosed loop, and it gives people the idea that they have a hope to change things within the system. And that's always a very controversial thing. Some people really debate about, can you change it within the system? But what I love about those two examples is that what we know is something that we've learned to discount over time. As everybody always notices when I come out, I don't have any eyebrows from the chemo I was on. Now, my cancer, the doctors have never been able to figure out what it's from. I know what it's from. I know it's not from my family. I know that it's from the environment that I was in. But you start to do that, you go in, and all the scientists have their hands tied. The doctors have their hands tied through insurance regulations. A lot of them have to play within the rules in order to maintain their job, and it sort of becomes a thing where they really have to choose a lot of times if they're going to preserve their careers or preserve the land. And so all these experts that we turn to are busy worrying about themselves instead of the things that really matter, to us. So Mitch says that there are some very strong protection regulations, but no real enforcement. How does any of these new laws bring enforcement? And that's a good point. Even when I was doing fishery patrols, there is never any. Sometimes they'll even write things down, but there's always a way these companies can kind of get around it. Now, Sherry says we shouldn't have to prove that they are harming us. They should have to prove they are not harming us. And that, Sherry, that is brilliantly said, and that is for sure a problem with the way things run already. Now, Scott Wilson has been fighting spraying down in Florida, and he says in Florida, the DEP, along with the FWC, obtained a legal constitution, not a statutory rule to create a constitutional law without a vote from the people, to purposely spray 17 chemical classes directly on all fresh waterways. So this is one of those things where even if they go out and they start to do their own testing, the science, they're not going to even pay any attention to the citizen scientists that are trying to fight back. So, and the reason I'm sort of saying all this is because, Tish, every time I talk to you, my mind gets blown and I have to kind of rethink it, because we don't realize we come from this colonial way of thinking, and we have this sort of paradigm and constrictions on our thinking that we think is just the way it's always been, and it makes sense. They've made it make sense to us, but in fact, we are denying our knowledge and the knowledge of the people in the land. And one thing I love about Invisible Hand is that it's the community members that know what the river should look like. They know what the water should look like. They know what the land should look like. The air should smell like. And when something is off, they're able to detect that. So I guess that brings me to a new question, which is, with all this science, they've got us running around trying to disprove their science with our science. And it seems like a very one-way sort of street. Now, using the examples you had with, slavery and with the Nazi Germany, how can we rethink our ability to protect nature outside of that continuous sort of rigged game that they have of the science, the business of science.
Right. Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Right. But we can't even, the first step is decolonizing our mind because we doubt ourselves. You know, we say that box example again, right, with the box cutters. You know, we can't even start thinking about how would we do it differently because we're so stuck in how it's done. So,
Mm.
you know, a big part of like, you know, we do a democracy workshop school, whatever you want to call it, to try and help people try to flip some of this in their heads because it's so powerful. And, you know, back to the indigenous question you had asked, that, you know, from reading this book and all that, their whole culture and even their language talks about nature differently than us. And so, you know, we all are now starting to hear the stories about how, you know, indigenous children were kidnapped and put in, you know, taken to those Christian missionary schools. And one of the things is, you know, their language was crushed. And she talks about that in the book with her native language. There's only 9 people in the country that still speak it. And there's some young people that are trying to learn it. And if I, it's called Potawatomi. I hope I didn't like say it too bad, but you know, she describes their language and she says their language is 70% verbs, and they have a different way of talking about living and non-living things. Like obey in their language is a verb and an so it can be a verb because it can become something else. If it's allowed to flourish and thrive, it could become a river. It could change into something else. Whereas she says English is based, it's only 30% verb. So we're 70% nouns. And she says something about, well, it makes sense for a culture obsessed with things, right?
That's true.
But you know, language is so important because she gives this example and it really stuck with me. She said, think about, okay, your grandmother's in the kitchen cooking something at the stove and somebody walks in and says, what's it cooking? Well, we'd be like appalled by that, you know, like that's disrespectful calling it. But, you know, we talk about nature of it being inanimate and calling nature it, right? Whereas in her language, they don't, right? Everything is talking about nature in much more like sentient type language. So, and we even stop toddlers in our language, right? Well, think of a toddler. I know when my son was little, you know, you take him to the park and nature and see a frog. Oh, isn't he cute? You know, and it's like, oh, he's not a he, it's an it, you know. Or the trees, you know, they might describe them, or a bird as a she or they. And, you know, the pronouns, we stop it and say, no, that's an it. Well, she says, you know, like if you have a beautiful tree, maple tree or something, it's much easier when it's an it to take a chainsaw to it or spray it with chemicals or whatever. So it's so simple, but it's about decolonizing our minds. And I thought, you know, that's what they did when they took those children and had them unlearn their culture and their language and only learn ours. But we've kind of been colonized in the same way. We just weren't kidnapped and put in these schools. We never knew the other way. So, you know, I just think our science speaks of the language of objects. You know, everything is reduced to the mechanics, how it works, and it puts boundaries on our knowing, you know, and so what we can't grasp and, you know, our understanding, it remains unnamed. We don't name it if we haven't, you know, to me, it reminds me of the arrogance of Western law and science, because I think of the Columbus story, you know, like he landed here and found the land, you know, so until we find something and discover it, like it doesn't exist until we discovered it. When you think about it, it makes no sense. It's much easier to destroy things that are its than if you believe it's, you know, a living entity.
Yeah, no, that actually, you know, Noam Chomsky talks a lot about that, and for anybody that's not familiar with him, he's a world-renowned linguist. But what he determined in his book, Manufacturing Consent, was the idea that language is used as a tool to keep everybody's minds from wandering too far off the course it's supposed to be on, based on the conversation that's being controlled by those in charge. We don't study language in its entirety, but they do, and they understand how to make these sort of associations. And I think that what you just said is another amazing example of it. That's really incredible about the amount of verbs versus nouns in the two types of belief systems and views on the world. It really does make a big difference, and it's so true about it. It drives me crazy when people, will look at a dog and say, "Oh, it." And I'm like, no, it's male, female. They're not, and it's that disassociation. In film, there's a psychological theory called the other theory, and the idea is that you define yourself based on how you define the other thing instead. So that way, back in the early sci-fi movies in the 50s, we would see these aliens as these invaders, and then we were always the good guys in this resolution. So there's a lot, and I mean, it's true. If you grow up and you're very different, you don't know you're different until all the other kids start to tell you how and why you're different. And the language is very often built on dividing instead of connecting. And that's one thing that I think when you talk about the it, that really stands out. That is about the division and saying that thing doesn't have the same respect, or it doesn't deserve the same rights, or it doesn't have the same importance that I have as a person. And that really is a colonialized way of thinking that we've just been so ingrained in so many generations that people tend to forget.
Right. And it's that whole idea of like talking about water, like the right to clean water. If it's just for human benefit, like, we want humans have the right to clean water. Well, what about all the rest of the life, on the planet? Doesn't it also have the right to clean water? But, so yeah, everything's about us.
When you say that, it's interesting too, because so many companies will dump into rivers and kill fish. They become zones where all the oxygen is depleted and all the animals start to die, and then other animals will drink from the river. But all we care about is what it comes through our processing plants and through our tap instead of the water. So we consider water as what comes out of our tap or our shower, but in fact the water in the river, before it goes through these processes, which are terrible anyway, they just tend to be over-chlorinated, but we never take into account the rest of it. And somehow we think maybe it's just easier for people to go to bed at night thinking that everything in nature will be fine, as long as we're cleaning our water. And that is but it all goes back back into the rivers. Like Sherry brings up a great point, that the Florida's roads, they're just allowed radioactive toxins to be used in the roadways. And a lot of that is the photogypsum that comes out of the whole phosphate mining project. And now they're going to put it in the roads. And so every time there's a rain, some of that, and that stuff is so radioactive, they're not allowed to do anything with it except hold it. They're not allowed to dispose of it technically. And now they're trying to do that.
Well, they're spreading it on our roads, that radioactive, but that's the whole thing again. That's science, right? They're going to use science to all of a sudden now flip it from being hazardous to having a beneficial use. So that's another way, they do it, and I think one of the things that's really important is to think, well, science not without value choices, right? But who's deciding what's important for them to study? What research gets funded and who decides that? As an example, like I think we were talking about this in childhood leukemia, so there's a ton of money put into childhood leukemia and finding a cure for the leukemia, but there's no research even on possible environmental links or causes. And I told you the story of the pediatrician I know who, 15-year-old healthy individual boy comes in. He's got a brain tumor, large brain tumor, but the doctor's not allowed to ask if he uses a cell phone, what model does he use? How many hours a day, does he put it up to his head? So if the doctor's not allowed to ask those questions, that means there's no links can be made. So when they make the statement saying there's no data or research that can show a link between cell phone usage and childhood leukemia, well, it's a true statement.
Yeah.
Because they're not collecting the data. So there's no research on this and nobody's funding that research. Instead, we all get sucked into, oh my God, race for the cure, do all this, give your money to that. But nobody is willing to put funding into where those links you're talking about. Like you said, you just know it's from the environment. It makes sense. You're putting toxins in the water, the toxins are coming back to us. My grandfather, his 8th grade education, knew that. Indigenous people know this, but somehow, we don't believe it. Our government and the agencies and all the activists, no, we have to have this data. It's a hamster wheel we keep spinning in.
Yeah, and it really is because, I know we've talked about this before, but there's the upstream solution of stopping it before it becomes a problem, and then the downstream solution where, and if we think of it in terms of pollution or plastics, you've had the factories up here that are going on doing whatever they want, and then as everything comes downstream, it comes to trying to clean the water or do a beach cleanup or something along those lines. And so as long as we're focused on trying to help the what we consider the solution instead of actually stopping the problem, it continues in this crazy cycle. I know when I worked in some studios that had signs to say, warning, this building has chemicals known to cause cancer. And when I went in to talk to my doctors, they didn't really take that into account because it's not part of what they're allowed to treat for. They have very specific things they're allowed to treat. Think of it as, and that's where all the research money goes. The research money goes into genetics. It doesn't go, can you imagine if we had the same amount of money that people put into trying to understand the genetic, chain of cancers, if we had the same amount of money for environmental investigators that could go out and say, this company is obviously dumping stuff that has these chemicals. And that's another example of the business of science. Science will be used to say, what we dump is fine, but it can never be used to say what you dump is cancerous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, look at all the examples from the past. The tobacco industry, what we find is that they've had studies, right, all along, knowing that the climate change studies like that Exxon's done, the, asbestos studies, lead, all that, it comes out, decades later. Once they can't ignore the problem, it's so horrible, then like this stuff comes out. And that's the difference between rights of nature law, because that's what lawyers have to do too. You were talking about doctors, lawyers, same thing. They have to defend the law as is, right? The way it's written, but it's been written lopsided and biased, right? 1% to protect them and property and profits. But that's what they're trained to do, just like the doctors are trained a certain way. So yeah, it's this whole, vicious system. They've actually created it, to benefit them all the way around. But rights of nature is actually more about proving that the activity that you want to do, before it's actually harmed, nature. So you have to say, prove to me that this isn't harmful, kind of like what Sherry was saying there, because there's rights here and you have to prove that your activity isn't going to harm nature.
Yeah, the burden of proof really should be on them, not us, to try to stop it. I know there was another battle in Florida where they brought in a lot of their own water testing, and they all said, no, it's not good for this reason, this reason, this reason, and of course gave the permit out anyway. And, like Mitch was saying, permitting is just giving permission. And actually, I found out a lot of local legislation, they actually are set to where they are not allowed to deny permits. And again, it turns out that a lot of these regulatory agencies are there to be, just to kind of encourage everybody to relax a little bit and to just take things as they are. Another great example is there's this thing called the Florida Phosphate Institute, and it's run by supposedly a private company, but it's actually funded by the state. And what they do they're actually the ones that have pushed to get this, to get all this radioactivity on the roads. They actually told me when I talked to them, and I did a little interview with them, they told me that their idea was to take all this this photo gypsum that they're not allowed to do anything with, and make it non-potable water that communities can use so they can sell it back to the communities. It's bad enough they already take their runoff and sell it to all the nation as fluoride. So we already have the chemical, thing in there. And it really seems to me that if we really were protected by these chemical harm, that a lot of these companies have to fold.
Right.
So I feel like
it becomes a question of responsibility, right? See, that's all that's missing from our laws and our system and all that. There's a response. I mean, we'd be forced, like, let's say in a community, okay, this corporation wants to come in and do this. Oh, it's going to create jobs. Well, you also now are responsible, for the water pollution in your community, the air pollution, the increase. So if you took that into account, we don't take that into account, or how is it going to affect the next several generations? See, that's nowhere in our system and equation. There's no obligation or responsibility to, the people in the community that are going to come after us, or nature that comes after us. And that's just not there. But if it was, and you knew, like the community even knew, we can be held liable, like you're talking the downstream thing, like, okay, yeah, we're going to get the jobs from this and make money, but that pollution is going to go downstream. We can be held liable then later for that. There may be different decisions that are made. And yeah, you're right. I mean, people, they would have to look more closely at that, and they're going to have to make decisions. What's more important to them? What do they value more? And then maybe the company won't go in. I mean, the business won't happen.
A friend of mine,
the waste, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's not going anywhere. That's the all these chemicals are mostly forever chemicals, like PFAS and PFOS and a lot of these other chemicals that we've been learning about, like the Teflon, the C8, all these things. There is nowhere they never dissipate over time. I was talking to a friend of mine who is Iroquois, and he said to me, well, every decision that we make, we think about 7 generations ahead. And we make the decision based on how it'll affect those 7 generations. And I do feel like, so we're kind of talking about the change in mindsets, that the modern colonial mindset is just the now.
Right.
We're just focused on what
profits now, today. Yep.
Well, okay. So now, one thing on the conservation conversation that we always like to do is, I don't want everybody to feel like they're defeated and that they can't do anything, because we actually have a stronger voice than we're allowed to know. And if we do speak up in unison together, we can really make a change. So knowing that the system kind of works like this, how do you see that we could move forward and make changes? Because we're not going to be able to do it in the traditional science battling science.
Right. And I'm not saying all science is bad. Obviously, you need, science is good. But, at what point, like we've talked about this before, like, when this chemical's toxin, the scientists have discovered this and it has these effects, it's carcinogen, when do you say, well, okay, forget it, that's enough studies, we know that? It's like, no, we don't want that put in the water. And I guess, it gets back to the box idea. People have to stop thinking about, the individual harm being done in my community at this river at this point, and join with other communities that are willing to change the system itself. And, how do we do that? I mean, we have to, maybe we ignore the system. I mean, that's one thing, or we keep going and playing in it. It gives it credibility, right? People think it's credible. I mean, if we change the faces, that'll fix the problem. If we do the regulatory hearing, maybe we'll get lucky and they won't issue that permit. But that's not addressing the system. And maybe we need to start ignoring the system so much and coming up with our own alternative. And COVID, again, we talked about this last time, I think, has kind of created some of that. People in their communities are having to come up with solutions because the government's not coming to save them, or communities that have been hit by hurricanes and, different environmental disasters and weather disasters, the wildfires out west. There's no, cavalry coming to save you. And so they get together and come up with solutions for their own community. That's an invisible hand, the story of Grant Township. They're saying, no, this is our law. We're going to write the law here and we're going to enforce our law. They're not to the end of their story yet. Their story's still ongoing. They were just sued last week. I'm losing track of time. I think it was just last week again by PGE trying to turn their charter that they passed. And, so will the courts do that? We don't know. I mean, if they don't, great. That means the local law stood and it can't go in the injection well. But if the courts overturn it, then it's back in the community's hands. What are they willing to do? Are they going to do direct action, to block, to stop it? I mean, that's really what it's going to come down to. Or what are we willing to do to stop the poisoning and the destruction, for the future? And I don't know. I mean, I think communities, they have a lot of really creative ideas, and if we could allow our brains, we censor our ideas and our thoughts by this system. Like we could free our minds, I think we would come up with solutions. I mean, humans are good at that. Not only that, we could look to indigenous people. They lived here for a long, long time before we got here and didn't screw it all up. So we need to pay them more respect and listen to their ways and learn from each other, and maybe there's a way, like that's why that book's so interesting. I mean, it's science. She's a scientist, but an indigenous woman who understands that culture too. And imagine how powerful we could be if we work together to come up with solutions.
I love that. And, that is what it's going to require. And that's what I love about what you guys do is you change where the playing field happens. Instead of it being in this cycle of, corporate controlled courts, corporate controlled regulatory agencies, you're going to move that power back over to the communities and back to that. And, and it's true. We even saw it in our food distribution in the country. The whole system just broke down, and the people that are just making a killing off of feeding us, they didn't know what to do anymore. So a lot of people just stepped up and said, hey, I have a simple idea. Everything, convoluted and complex for so many middlemen to make money, but why don't we just get the food to people? And it's simple idea. And kids in high school, kids in college have come up with better systems over the last year than we had for the last 50. So it really is a new looking back at we kind of went from local to national, and now we're kind of coming back to this understanding of local, which I think really is part of that. You talk about the change of sort of undoing our colonial form of thinking. Let's see. And now everybody also, while we have Tish on, please feel free to ask questions directly to her. She's an amazing resource, and I would love to use this time for everybody to have a big conversation. Mitch says, the public officials already show that they are against the rights of nature. So when we move to asking for a right to clean water, how will they speak against our right to clean water? Would any politician actually tell someone that we don't have a right to clean water? Mitch, that's interesting. I think that goes back to Tish, what you were saying about language. They're never going to say that. They're never going to say, you don't have a right to clean water. They're going to say, this company promises that the water is clean.
Right.
There's like one conversation goes that way and one goes that way.
Right. And the regulatory agency will require them to submit samples and whatever, and we'll test it and all that, so yeah, don't worry.
And, tobacco, the tobacco companies paid for studies to prove that everything was fine until something was leaked out. I know that Mosaic in Florida does that. They test their own water. According to the law, they have to test their water once a month, and they do, and they use their own lab. And wouldn't you know it, all the water is as clean as can be, yet all the fish are dying, all the animals are dying, people are getting cancer at accelerated rates, and we should not have to pay a toll for other profit. I think that, it's so far removed. There has to be a point in between the two where everybody can get along. I shouldn't have cancer because somebody needed to dump stuff in the water, and it happens to a lot of. I think the problem is a lot of innocent people, especially a lot of children get it, and parents don't realize it. They, when you're in your shower, your body takes in so much of the water. It's actually, very porous, and all the steam carries all the chemicals. And so you really can't get around it. And the concept of purifying the water is too much of a downhill solution. What we need to do is keep the water clean. Um, Danielle works a lot with indigenous tribes around the world, working to preserve the rights of water and the rights of nature, turtles and other things. And she and I actually talk quite a bit about the colonial mindset. So I'm glad she's on here. And it's true, we've been taught to censor and not have solutions. And that's a great point. We are taught that the solutions will come from the adults in the room, whoever's in charge. We've just sort of, said, okay, they'll come up with something for us. And as Sherry said, the law allows it.
Well, yeah, and I've been with so many groups, and you start talking in a community, they'll bring me in. It's like, okay, we have this problem, this is coming, we don't want this. And then they'll start like with ideas. Well, we need to get them to do this. And they'll be like, oh, we can't do that. Someone in the room goes, we can't do that. They'll never do that. The law won't be on our side. The, politicians will never go for that, and that's what I mean. We stop ourselves. Or, and we saw this with the civil rights movement, where they did a lot of like alternative systems, right? The Black Panthers did some of that. Well, what if we build on something like that and look at it in our communities? I mean, that's what the invisible hand, they wrote a law. It's like, write the law the way we want it. Well, what if we have an election? Like in Ohio, they're trying to kill elections, not putting these on the ballot. What if we hold our own election in our community? And everybody right away goes, well, it won't count. And I'm like, well, but still hold the election. Why don't they want you to vote on something? Because they don't want to see the result. They don't want the dialogue. We have a court case going about this, a civil rights case right now in federal court. And it's like, think about it. Why don't they want you to hold an election? Because they don't want debate in the community. They don't want the information to come out. So we just won't let them vote on it. Well, hold the vote anyway. Have the campaign. See what the results are. If the people vote 80% one way, that says something. I mean, we can do things like that. I mean, direct action's another. What if we held our own court system? The courts keep over because they're only ruling on the side of industry. Let's have a people's type court. Set that up. It's all about getting it out in the public. That's why they're trying to squash rights of nature, right? And things like that. I'm sure they won't like that we're talking about this, right? So, because the more we talk to, and anybody listening to this, share this information, talk to your neighbors and friends about this, get a dialogue going about it, because that's going to help.
I was just reading about the Senate bill that they're trying to pass to prevent protests. And they're trying to, it's amazing. And in Florida, again, another example of they passed
it in Ohio this week. Yeah, they passed it in Ohio this week.
Did they? Gee,
yeah.
Wow, that is crazy. So they're trying to preemptively stop speech and stop expression, because so many people are now understanding and learning that their voice can have a big change. That's crazy that they did that in Ohio. That really, and I mean, I know Ohio is one of the really strong points where you guys have been working a lot to try to promote rights of nature, try to get the power back in the hands of the communities. Because, if you think about it, people always say, oh, I moved to this place, I really like it, it's a great community. We think in community, but we allow ourselves to be ruled by overlord.
Yeah, and the system, right? And the system we're talking about, this applies everywhere, because sometimes people go, well, I'll move. This is too much for me here. I can't handle this. I'm going to go move somewhere else. This system is in place. Like you said, in Florida, they're trying to pass that law now, anti-protest. They passed it in Ohio. They've passed it in other places. Missouri's now passed a preemption law against rights of nature. I mean, this just goes on, and it's with every issue. The system's set up the same, so it doesn't matter where you move to. Well, yeah.
And, it does come back to the fact that these corporations have 100 lawyers on staff, people that find ways to work within the construct, but the construct being designed to protect them, although us being kind of fooled into thinking that it's there to protect us, very much like the regulatory agencies. And ever since I had you on the show last time, it has really changed my way of thinking about all of these agencies and about all of the approaches that we can take. And, instead of saying, all right, I'm going to go do some water tests and go try to fight them in court, it's more about saying, okay, how can we pull the decision making away back to us?
Right.
And
I would say do that water test, find out what's in the water, and then share it throughout the whole community. I mean, get it out to everyone who lives in the community. But instead, we take that data when we have it and go to the electeds. We go to the system to say, oh, look what we found. Like, this is bad. We're going to the wrong people. Take a flyer, put that in, get it into every single resident in the community, because once the whole community knows about it and is pissed off about it and doesn't want it, that's going to have more of an impact than, 3 council people.
That's a great point. No, that is a really great point, and it's so true. That is it's again the way we've been brought up in that way of thinking. Okay, now we have it. We know that the legislature, they'll see the truth, and that's, we all know that they don't work for us. Politicians don't work for us. I mean, you can ask anybody if they think Congress is in our best interest. Nobody will ever say, yeah, of course, and it's like this weird political theater that people play into. But and that's a great point. When you have the information, tell the people, because the people together in unison can demand a change and demand a change in the way things are done. But it's a good point. And you're not going to go, no legislation has ever said, well, we should change this for the benefit of the people, unless they're absolutely forced to by public pressure. And public pressure is a great thing. The more people learn, that's what I love about being able to have an online family and an online community and an online discussion like this today, is that these concepts are seeds that can go into every community around the world and enable them to stand up and fight back in a very effective way. I think that that's really incredible what you guys are doing, to not just stay sort of in the background working on legal action only, but also working on knowing how to spread that and how to let communication do its work, and how because we really do need to come together. And I mean, we've seen it especially recently. Everybody is very divided, and it goes back to the language, like you're talking about. The language that we've heard in the last few years has been so divisive.
Right.
I know people that just they all want the same thing in life, and yet they're arguing about little things that mean nothing, instead of talking about things that are everything.
Yeah, to end with that on a really positive tip, like we were talking about this, I was talking with Sherry about this, and I said, what we need to do, and it's more of an indigenous way. I think that's where I read it too, but I'm sorry, I can't remember where, but that is a community, because we all share this space in a community. And when we first start talking with someone, let's focus on the things we have in common first. We same air. We want the community to be healthy. We want our kids to be healthy. We want them to be educated well. We want healthy food, all this stuff, and then get to the parts where you might disagree. But once you formed like that connection with somebody with all these things in common, but we start right away, and our system does that too, I think, in our government and the media, that we start with the things we don't agree on immediately. So you don't have this connection at all. So start with what you have in common first.
That it sounds so simple when you say it, but I think that's really brilliant, and it's something that doesn't happen. I mean, if we start with kindness and unity, and we're open to each other, I always say that we're like a giant encyclopedia set. There's so much you can learn from everybody else, and I love that very simple but super powerful and important thing. Start with what you have in common. Start with what you all want in common, and you can see it even in the county commissioner meetings. People will go as a whole, people that don't agree with anything outside of the county commissioner rooms, but they sit down, they want clean water, they want nature, they want their grandchildren to be safe, and they start that, and as soon as they leave the meeting, they forget that. And so, these are the conversations we need to be having in and out of formal events. We need to have these same conversations in diners, as important as in county commissioner meetings. It says this is why we must use the wording "right to clean water," and It's very true. I mean, it sounds like it's the most basic thing. I'm sure you saw that they're now going to be adding water to the natural elements that are on the stock exchange.
Oh yeah, now it's a commodity. Yeah, we're going to sell it and profit from it.
Mm-hmm. Now
Right.
that to me is a very big alarm. That's very dangerous. We've entered that range. Now, activists I know for 30 years have been screaming, listen, we're running out of clean water. They're going to make it a commodity. Then we're really going to be in trouble. So now, Tish, what would you say to maybe a small town where they're starting to notice, more sickness, more illness, they're starting to notice foam on their water or discoloration in their water? What would sort of be the first step? Because you guys deal with a lot of communities that are fighting back.
Mm-hmm. Usually when the communities come to us, they already know that, they know where it's coming from. They've already done that research, they've done, because that's where science does come in, because you can't, like, where is it coming from? What's causing it? What is this? So usually when they come to us, they've already done that stuff. They know it's coming from here or, whatever. And then you have to figure out, well, how are we going to stop this? What do we as a community want to do together to stop this? That's where the conversation has to begin. And there's a huge education element because we're all so colonized, right? So the conversation we're having, there's a handful of people maybe, but we need to continue that. So that's why we always start with the education process first, because until people understand, they're going to keep going back in the hamster wheels we've talked about.
And I think what you were talking about today that's been very important is the idea of deconstructing what we just sort of accept as a foundation to start building these arguments and these thoughts on. But in fact, our foundation is the very thing that is the constriction that'll prevent us from ever being able to move forward with change.
Right. And democracy is, we all want democracy, talk about it. It's our claim to fame here, right? But it's participatory. It's not a spectator sport. And, there's people, it's like, yeah, it's hard. Well, I don't have the time. I'm busy. Well, it's a trade-off. I mean, that means you're allowing other people to make the decisions for you. And so this is what we've got now, the results of that. We're living with the results. I mean, we have to be part of this. So, yeah.
I love talking to you about this. I think it really, and it is amazing. Like I said, we've started with that, and then we gave all the control away, very much like our food. It all became industrialized, and we all thought, well, this industrialized thing will really benefit everybody. And then as we went on, it all became worse for us. And now we're coming back to our communities, and it's really a great thing because we're seeing it build more and more. And we're seeing more and more people being willing to stand up and say no more. But, I think one thing that really caught me with this conversation is the idea that we can't take our science and our tests and go and just expect for the legislation to change for us because we open their eyes or their minds. From what you've been saying, they kind of already know what's happening.
Yeah, they do know.
Yeah, so
some do, some don't. I mean, they don't, they just believe whatever they're told, but there's a lot of them there that, they've written the laws and the regulations or worked with the corporations, they know them. So, yeah.
Well, that's the other thing I want to talk about. If you go to opensecrets.org, it's a wonderful website. I like to use it. It can show you who has invested in that politician's election campaign. And then you kind of can figure out who they owe, if they're in there, who they owe their allegiance to. Because, it's all about favors. Once, somebody pays 10 grand, 20 grand. And for example, the phosphate mining industry in Florida, they pay for the majority of the politicians that are actually in there right now. But then it comes to ALEC, and we have a situation where these corporations are actually writing the laws, and people, again, because it's so complicated, they think that their senators come up with great ideas to save their neighborhoods. But in reality, the corporations are writing the laws and then getting whoever they bought through their campaign donations to be the puppet and push that law forward. So it becomes a sense of political theater. And people get so wrapped up in political theater that they forget about the sort of the real monsters that are actually out there poisoning us every single day. Jason says, does it not cost community members quite a big sum of money to take on large name industries?
Sure it does. Of course it does. That's because the system they use that fear. That's why people don't. But that's why I think we need alternative ways, because if you go to court, even if you invest that money, most of the time you're going to lose anyway, because the system's set up, to benefit them. I mean, that's one of the lawsuits we're fighting in Ohio, the people's civil rights. It's a civil rights lawsuit. And do they have the right to free speech? Do they have the right to due process when putting things on the ballot? And it's even voter suppression. We're using if you keep these off the ballot. But the corporations have these rights, and they're saying it's a violation of their rights when you try to stop them. It's a takings, right, of their property or their right to make profit. So, that's the problem, that they have more rights and more wealth and power than we do. That's why I say it's a power shift. So, maybe that isn't the best thing to try to take on the large corporate. I mean, we have to be strategic about this. So, there isn't a silver bullet single answer to any of this. Like, do this. It's not like a cookie cutter thing. It's a movement, and it's a movement to change the system, which the people who have the system in their control don't want it changed. So they're going to fight tooth and nail. So, I think we do have to look. That comes back to the school we're doing. It starts January 5th. You can go to CELDEF's website, it's on there, or Sherry at Clean Water Now can give you information on that as well. But until we start, not playing in that system and trying to figure out different ways, and probably on a public, forum like this isn't a good way to let them know what we're up to.
I hope they're not watching. Yeah. Well, and that's very interesting, because that is one of the sort of the big keys. I know you guys have your democracy school, and most people would say, I already know what democracy is. I learned about it in my civic class in 5th grade or 7th grade or whatever. But what they learned about was the false impression of how things should run. And, in all that, there's sort of a belief that every piece of the puzzle will run in sincerity and honesty and transparency, all for the good of the people. But as we've learned, with corporations having personhood, the system does pretty much run all for the good of those people.
Guess who wrote your civics textbooks? Yeah.
See, there you go. So I like the idea that that we really need to retrain our approach to it, because we can't just enter into the arena. That it's a very rigged game that they've got going on. But with our change of consciousness and our growing of understanding and our attachment to community and our being able to re-educate ourselves, that was one of the amazing things too that I found in a lot of places that I travel to for work, is that when you get somewhere into a community and there's a problem, these people, no matter what community it is, they are so well educated. They have a PhD on whatever it is that they're being attacked by. You learn every nook and cranny of it. And it really is amazing the amount of work and passion that it takes for local activists to even make things become, an event. Like we had talked about Aaron Brockovich before, and, you had brought up a great point that, stinging the company with a small fine isn't going to change the way they do business. And in a sense, that was staying within the system, in the same system that's going to keep the wheels rolling. The people that are in California that are in those communities are still being poisoned.
Oh, yeah.
So it didn't force a hand of change. And people can be so powerful that they're doing the preemptive laws. That's how scared they are of what you guys have been doing. And the change that CELDEF has been making is that they're starting to see that communities can fight back. And so the only way they can do it is to try to cut it off before it can start.
And just to correct you, it's not us doing it really, it's the people in the communities. I mean, they're the backbone of this. It's the people that are willing to take the risks. You know, the people in Grant Township, the people in Toledo who passed, you know, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, and they're the ones that are doing the on the ground. We're helping them and advising them, but they're the ones willing to take the risk. So
like Sherry says, we are still the 99%, you know, and that's what I wanted to bring up to everybody, that if you're in your community and you're not sure what next step to take, CELDIF's a great thing. CELDIF is not like you said, it's not a silver bullet. It's not the answer. You guys aren't out there investigating where to go next to try to change laws. Communities come to you for assistance in how to take their knowledge and what they've learned and what they know is happening and try to fight it with that upstream solution of changing it before it becomes a problem, before people get sick, before people have to pay too much of a toll. And I think that's really important because you guys, you know, so many conservation groups or NGOs or groups like that present themselves as some sort of an answer. But I think what you guys do is create a roadway to help communities achieve what they want in their communities. And I think that's a very important thing. And I don't really think anybody else is out there doing that for the good of the people.
Yeah, we're trying to like live, you know, what we preach kind of thing. And, you know, we're trying to connect communities too that are doing it. Because that's the whole thing. It's about connecting. So we have state networks, community rights networks, and then when there's a national community rights network, because we can all learn from each other, you know, and that's what they don't want. You know, they don't want us connecting and learning from each other and growing this movement. So that's important.
It's true. Yeah, that's true. I'm sure they've got their eyes on you guys. And you know what? Like an invisible hand. One thing that really struck me was there's a clip in there. And by the way, everybody, if you haven't seen Invisible Hand, check it out. It's an incredible documentary, and it is about changing. And it all comes down to changing our perspective, decolonizing our thoughts, and renewing our approach on how we see nature. The one thing that kind of upset me, actually, in the movie was the way that Comedy Central, The Daily Show, which is normally, I think, a very informative and very progressive news. You know, a lot of times you can even get your news from them more so than like newscasters. They didn't really even understand the concept of, they sort of held on to the colonizing view. They kind of made fun of and didn't fully understand the concept of decolonizing the thought system that way. And so that was one of the parts of the movie that really jumped out at me, was that you're going to have so many people that aren't going to take a few minutes to think about it, and they're just going to defend the colonial way of thinking. How do you find that in your work, and how do you tend to deal with that when you come up against that sort of opposition?
Well, The Daily Show, to give them credit, I mean, I don't know if you saw the whole clip. In Invisible Hand, they just have a little section of it, but they like a whole 5-minute, I think, you know, or so. They came to Toledo, you know, and they did this whole thing. And when you see the whole thing, I think they were trying to just raise awareness of rights of nature, to get people to, through a humorous kind of way. So, you know, to give them
good.
Yeah. And it was, you know, and it was like, yeah. So yeah. And I'm sorry, I forgot like now the question.
Yeah, no. I was gonna say, you know, when you start to talk about rights of nature, people, I'm sure, just have this visceral reaction, like, well, what do you mean? It's more important that I get water. It's more important that I have blah 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 than the tree does. You know, do you find that opposition a lot, or you know, with people, or is it mostly the opposition in the courtroom?
It's the industry that usually does that now, and people, you know, we're more so, but it's amazing to me. And that's why when people say, well, this is going to take so long, and it's like, actually, I'm shocked by how much progress we've made, you know, in just a few years. Because when I first started doing this work and was going to communities, when I would say rights of nature, they would criticize and go, oh my God, what are you going to do? Put a squirrel on the witness stand kind of thing. That anymore. Now people are like, well, yeah, that makes total sense. that make, but it's industry that like comes up with phony things like, oh, you won't be able to cut your grass anymore. Or you won't be able to cut a tree down on your property, and they do that stuff. Yeah, it's really, just to give you some hope. I mean, it's changed a lot in just a few years.
See, and that's amazing, and that is the beginning of a very strong movement. Like Jason Staples says, everybody knows to have a Coke and a smile, but people are blinded by what these industries are really doing to our natural resources, and that's true. I mean, Coke is a great example of one of the worst polluters in the world. I was in the middle of the Amazon. I didn't see people for 4 days on the river, and floats by us a plastic Coke bottle. And there was a massive petition to ask them to stop using plastic, and they didn't, because I know, as you're aware, and I'm not sure if our audience is, Keep America Beautiful, the group that does a lot of the anti trash and anti-litter ads back from the 70s and everything, is actually a group of Coke and all these other companies that use styrofoam and plastics, and instead of taking the blame for themselves, they say, you people are littering, you're the problem. And it's another deflection. They're like the David Copperfield of responsibility. They're just like deflect, and people say, oh my gosh, did that guy throw the thing on the ground? That's terrible. And meanwhile, the factories are pumping out all this stuff in the background. So we have, in a sense, been fooled on the spin control quite often. And
it's your fault. It's your fault and my fault. It's not their fault. It's your fault and my fault.
Yeah.
You don't have any other choice when you go to the store. Like when they're like, look at Amazon. They're going to control. You're not going to have any choice where else to go buy things, right? But it's your fault. It's your fault you're buying there. No, they're really good at that, and they do too, the really slimy, like where they'll use their name and give it to a community to build a rec center or to build a park or whatever, and it's then the Cola amphitheater or whatever, and you're like, oh well, I guess they're good for the community.
They're part of it. Yeah, exactly. It's for every stadium. I mean, growing up as a kid, stadiums had names of people. There was John F. Kennedy. There was, all these different, Ronald Reagan. There were all these different names of people. Now everything is the Sprint Center and the Pepsi Stadium, and we've really seen this changeover, and they've ramped up their attacks in the last 20 or 30 years, and so I'm really impressed that your organization has been able to stand up and fight back, and I know you guys have made a huge change in a lot of local communities, and I'm really excited to see what's on the horizon next, because there's a lot, and you guys fight for it out of your hearts. And I think there is that expression, with pure heart and clean hands. If something is done that way, it's going to survive. Jerry, be kind to nature, and she'll be kind to you. Which I like that. So, usually, Tish, of course, we've ended up talking quite a bit today. I love it.
It's only an hour.
I said, well, we're going to try to keep it. But, I mean, honestly, like I feel like we could go 4 or 5 hours easily. There's so many more questions I have. But before we do wrap it up, I wanted to ask anybody that's watching, if you have questions for Tish, right now is a perfect time to go ahead and post them in the comments, and she can answer them directly. If you don't want to put it on the show or have it publicly announced, go to celdf.org, CELDF.org, send a message in, and you can ask questions, and you can find out how they can help your community and your local battle. But as we talk about this business of science and sort of the rig game that a lot of us, including myself, have tried to go up against and learn very quickly that in that realm, we can't always have a success. Is there anything else that we didn't touch upon that you wanted to add in our conversation today?
I don't know, do I have to stick to the topic about science, or?
No, you can say anything you want to talk about. Whatever you're passionate about, go ahead. And
well, I mean, there's so much, like you said, we could go on forever.
Yeah.
One of the I'm really encouraged by the way at this time, because with COVID and communities having to depend on themselves, plus with the Black Lives Matter movement and obviously an Indigenous people coming forward, that connecting all these things, I mean, I really have more hope than I did before. And I know it seems like 2020 was such a bad year for everyone, but I feel like there's a lot that can come out of this if we don't all just go back to normal. Like that thing about, oh, we want to get back to normal. It's like, no, not really normal. Let's go create something better than what we had. And so I think that's really important, and that people don't, depending on what happens now in 2021, it's so easy to slide back into, what was. But, I think the Occupy movement, I want to give them credit that they really started something really important, because we're not looking at things in the traditional way. They were looking at it 99% versus 1%. And I think that, now there's our chance to build upon that, take that further, because at least it was focused on putting the attention in the right place. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's very well said. And that's true. They were sort of the first group that said, hey, listen, we understand that this isn't what you've been telling us for the last 50 years, just isn't how it goes.
Right.
And there's nothing more important than our health, or our children's health, or our grandchildren's health, really, at this point. And we are at this very critical juncture right now where, if we don't change things now, things are going to get worse and worse and worse. And I do often find too, a lot of it has to come through personal experience. Big concepts and the ideas of change don't affect things as much as people personally. When you personally get sick, like I do, you jump into action, because you don't want anybody else to have that happen. When you see a family member get sick, you suddenly learn about what's happening. And there is, and it's okay, I think it's important that we take our personal experiences and we take our personal knowledge, like you said, and we don't discount them, but actually use them as our foundation to know, trust ourselves. There's no reason to not trust ourselves.
Yeah, we've been taught to not trust that instinct we have, and what we know. So
let's see. Jason says, Tish, how do you inform cities or communities you are there to try to help them with their issues?
I'm not sure exactly. I mean, people contact us, and we do work with, if a community wants us to work with elected, like Grant Township, that story, that's the electeds in that community. Sometimes it's the community members, and the electeds aren't on the side of the people. And so we try to work with them if they have initiative, that route, and we can help them with that whole process. We provide legal support as far as, if they want to draft their own law. So it just depends. Again, it's not cookie cutter. There's no two communities that are alike. So it depends on the issue and how the people want to, proceed in that community.
Oh, great. And that just seems like such a perfect mix, the passionate community members and a team that can understand how to navigate these legal waters to make real change upstream and really do that. And I'm really curious to hear more about the Democracy School. And as you guys have the dates ready, I'd be more than happy to post it as well. So anybody that's watching can get the information off of my channel as well, and help promote it. I'd like to actually go to the school in January, so I'm excited to go and learn more, because your organization has really changed my way of thinking into solutions, and solutions are what it's all about. And that's what I love, is you guys are focused on the solutions. The problems are there, but now the question is, don't argue about that aspect of it, but how do we find long-lasting solutions? And instead of just trying to throw our bodies against a rigged game, that we're never going to be able to win. So you guys have found ways to actually allow communities to win, and I think that's incredible.
Yeah, and you guys have more of the answers in the community. I mean, you guys have the ideas. It's that knowledge, that it's where you live, this sense of place. especially people who have lived in a community for a while. They didn't just move there last week, but there's this sense of place that you develop, and you want to protect what you love. Like I have memories. I grew up in the community I'm in and by Lake Erie. I'm only 10 miles from Lake Erie. And so, my parents had memories here. I had memories growing up. My son grew up here. So there's like multi generations, that we all have memories about this place. And so it's very important. I mean, that's why you want to protect it. And that goes back to that indigenous way of thinking in their culture. Same thing. It's a sense of place, and you have an obligation to it. And so that it's there in the future and to protect it. So yeah, I think that's why the people in the communities will know more than we do when we come in. They know, like you had talked about that before, they understand, they know what the river's supposed to look like, or, what the landscape is supposed to look like, and something's off, something's not right. It was when this corporation came in and started doing, whatever activity, things started to get messed up. It's like,
You just keep pushing the goalpost further and further. They just get away with that.
Yeah.
Well, again, Tish, thank you for being on today. I would love to have you on again. I think there's so many aspects of what you guys do, and I love that we've been able to focus on each one during one of these shows, because it really is a changing of mindset. And I really appreciate all the work you guys are doing, and thank you for being on. And yeah,
thanks for having me. And it's people like you who allow us to get out to more people. So thank you, because there isn't a lot of the media that lets us do that.
That's true. Yeah, no, they tend to work with the coconut smile folks.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Tish. Well, thanks again for being on. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. Have a good holiday too.
You too. Enjoy the holidays, and Happy New Year. And we'll see you back on the show hopefully in January. So I think we should do this at like once a month if it's good with you. I would love to just keep talking about these topics. So
yeah, we have other people at CellDef too, so I can connect you with them. You can have other
I love that. The more we can learn, the more we can move forward. I love that. So
okay. Thanks, Eric. Bye.
So that was incredible. Like I said, I always really enjoy having Tish on the show. It is so informative. And, for me, having been working in conservation for a while, I was still approaching things with that colonial mindset. And it wasn't until I started talking to her that she really challenged the way that I was approaching trying to create change. And so it's a very powerful, very different thing. And I just think it's super important that we really re-examine how can we make a difference. Like I said, for me with my cancer, when I got it, I thought I want to stop. If I can just stop one person from getting this, it's worth it. And how do we do that? How do we fight back? And Tish gave us a lot of great examples, and a lot of it has to do with starting with ourselves, starting with our mindset, starting with our understanding of how the system works, and starting with our belief system, and really re-examining all those foundational aspects. Michelle says, thank you. Yeah, Michelle, I know works a lot with health, and so she probably sees a lot of these side effects as well. Sherry says, host a democracy workshop in your area. Oh, interesting. Contact celldef.org. And if you would like to co-host the screening of Invisible Hand in your community, please contact me. Oh, that's Sherry. That's awesome. Again, if you guys haven't seen this movie, it is amazing. It's the first of its kind, and it's the first time I've heard people discuss these types of topics in a new, fresh approach that actually can make a change. And again, we always say, make the change upstream, not downstream when it's already a problem. There's not much we can do past that. Mitch says, thank you, Tish. And Mitch works with We Can, and Mitch has does a lot of work down there to try to maintain the preservation and the quality of nature around him. So I know Mitch personally, and he is a nonstop activist. He's always fighting for the best. Danielle says, great chemistry, great interviews always. Thank you, Danielle. Yeah, and that's the thing, putting good energy out. It's like what Tish said. Let's start together, and then we'll find our differences later. Let's not start coming in butting heads to begin with. We need kindness, we need compassion, we need empathy, and we need love. Between all of us, we have to remember that we are all part of one group. And as I always say on the show, it's our world, so let's talk about it. It's important. Anyway, thanks everybody for joining again. This was a really exciting episode. I feel like I always learn so much whenever I get to talk to Tish, and I love everybody's comments. I get to learn from everybody. As a community, we can grow, we can learn, and we're just going to get better and better. So it's nice to see everybody again. Everybody take care. Think about what's happening in your neck of the woods, and if it's not setting right to you, definitely contact CellDef. They have had a great impact and are really, I think they're one of the most important parts of how we can change things for the future. Anyway, everybody, have a great holiday, and I will see you all next week for another show. All right. Remember, it is our world. Let's talk about it.